We're very excited to have Heidi Hasting present Power Up with a Power Platform. And I'm just going to go ahead and mute myself if we all want to mute ourselves. And then we can, Heidi, you'll let us know how you want to answer questions and stuff, and we will give you the floor.
Awesome. Thanks, Deb. Thanks, Josephine. And thank you for the WIC group. My name is Heidi Hasting. As Deb said, we're going to talk about powering up with the Power Platform. You've probably noticed too, I have an accent. I'm actually from Australia, but I'm currently in the US traveling for events. So we're going to cover a lot of things in as quick as possible. So we're going to talk about the different integrations that we have. Now, not going to go through all of them. There are more than this list, but we're going to talk about Power BI in Power Apps. We're going to do the inverse, Power Apps in Power BI. We're going to do Power BI and Power Automate and Power BI, and then we're going to look at some sort of ancillary products with Teams and PowerPoint and how they can integrate with Power BI as well. The first thing I wanted to cover off is what exactly is the Power Platform. Now, I will point out you will see Power BI on here. From a sort of marketing perspective, you'll hear about Power BI within the Power Platform, but generally it falls within Fabric, but it kind of gets mentioned in both. So we've got Power BI, that's our data visualization product. That's the thing that allows us to make our data look really cool, and it allows us to take insights from that data. And now it's been consumed inside Fabric as an experience within Fabric. Power Apps is our data entry product. That's where we can take data and store it and use it within the platform. Power Apps is a low-code, no-code experience editor. So if you wanted to create little small applications that allow you to capture data, Power Apps is there. If you're a pro code person, you might do like Azure App Service and build your own web app and host it there. We've got Power Automate, which is our business automation tool or business flow tool. So that's where we can do any number of workflows to do business process tasks. So that might be on trigger of an email coming in, we're going to send an alert, or it might be we're going to take action against our data and run a stored procedure, or it might be just, taking a screenshot of our Power BI report and sending it to an executive, as we'll do in today's session. Power Virtual Agent, I've got mentioned there, that's now been rebranded to Copilot Studio. I like to call it Power Virtual Agent, so I keep this slide in so I can remember. But yeah, it's one of the Copilot experiences now. Dataverse is the storage platform behind a lot of the Power Platform products. We're not going to touch Dataverse today, but it's important to know it exists. And then some other products that aren't considered Power Platform, but are part of the integration, which is, of course, Teams and PowerPoint. All right. So let's start with our journey. We're going to go on a bit of a journey today. And I will pre-warn you, I'm more of a data engineer than I am a data visualization person. So I've leveraged some stuff from the community in terms of Power BI reporting that looks way better than I did it myself. So we start with our executive reporting in sales. That's going to be a Power BI experience. Then, we're talking to the boss and they say, wouldn't it be great if we could actually see our monthly targets? But monthly targets isn't something we currently capture. So we need to capture that data and then make it available within our Power BI report. So we're going to integrate then Power Apps. And then it's like, yep, that's fantastic. Now let's look at some what if scenarios. What if we push the monthly targets by 10%, simulate adding that total? What would it look like? We can do that with Power Automate. And then the executives are busy, so they just want a screenshot in their inbox of how we're tracking. So we do that with Power Automate as well. That caveat, we'll use some premium connectors there, but I'll flag those so you know. And then we want to do some collaboration with the team, the people looking at the report. So we look to use Teams in that space. And then we want to take that board meeting to the next level so we can use PowerPoint. So this is going to be our journey throughout the session today. This is what we're going to cover. So let's start with our executive sales report. So it's a basic report here. You can see we've got our sales amount by order date. We've got our slicer, so we can look at which fiscal year we want to look at. We can look at the different bike sales that we've got, where we were doing different components, and we can look at our geographical information. So we have just a standard report, but we've only got sales, not monthly targets. So let's look to introduce Power Apps. So Power Apps is a visualization type within Power BI. Now I'm going to show you the screenshots as if it was Power BI Desktop, but I've noticed in the last couple of months, anytime I try and do this with Power BI Desktop, it fails, but you can do it with Service. So you can build Power BI reports in the Service as well as using the desktop. So we've got our report here. Then you'll see in the little visualization pane, we've got the option to add a Power Apps visual. So we drop that on the canvas, and now we can go ahead and edit that, and that will actually create a Power App. So within the editing experience, you're going to hit the little dot, 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 as a lot of people say in the community, everything you ever want is behind the three dots. We're going to hit the dot, 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 and we're going to edit. And that's going to take us through to the Power Apps IDE. So Power Apps is actually make.powerapps.com, if I remember precisely. And then within that, we're going to build a Canvas app. So if you've never played with Power Apps has a number of different app types. There's a model-driven app, there's a Canvas app, and then there's also things called like Power Virtual Pages. But in this case, we're going to use a Canvas app, which all that kind of means is we have to build all the elements on that app that we want. It's a low-code, no-code experience, so you do have the drag and drop capability, but it means you have to think about how do I want to lay this out. Mine looks quite ugly. That's because it's just used for demo purposes. So we've made the visual bigger so I can see all the different information. Power BI is helpful in that when you drop this app visual onto the canvas, it will give you all the information you need to get started. So we go in, we edit that, we then tell it what of the data elements from the Power BI report do we want to send to the Power App, because there has to be some level of integration there. So I'm going to say, hey, can you send the month key through to the Power App? That way the Power App knows what to associate to. So this will indirectly inside the Power App, it's going to put a Power BI integration element or data source effectively. And then that means I can work by integrating the two different products. So now we pick whether we want to create a new app or choose an existing one. And something I'll highlight is you'll see right up the top there, it's got Heidi Hasting bracket default. That's what's called an environment within Power Apps. It's akin to a workspace in Fabric Power BI. It's a container for your apps. So you want to make sure you're deploying or creating in the right container. And then we can create a new one or choose an existing one. Once you create it, editing it is simple until you decide to move the Power BI report. Then you basically have to recreate a lot of things. So don't worry if you have a bit of integration issues going forward. But we've gone ahead and we've created a new one. We switch then to the Power App Studio, which is at make.powerapps.com. Within the Power App Studio, I've just dropped a couple of labels on the screen for month key and target, and a couple of editable text boxes, one to show me the month key coming from the Power BI report, and one to allow me to enter a target. And this is connected to an Azure SQL database behind the scenes, so that when I enter a value for target, it's going to persist the value in the Azure SQL database. You can use any number of data sources. I could have used an Excel spreadsheet hosted on SharePoint. The reason I didn't is that Power BI will only let you refresh, I think it's like 8 times within a day when it's an Excel data source. So I wanted that more instantaneous experience, so I put it in an Azure SQL database. The downside on that is the Azure SQL database is a premium connector for Power Apps. So Power Apps has two licensing aspects. One is for the app itself and the consuming users, so whether they can access all apps or an individual app, and one is the connectors, so what that app is connected to, whether it's Excel, SharePoint list, Azure SQL, and all sorts of connectors. I think there's over 100 now. So in this case, we've built our app. It's a little lightweight. Behind the submit button that you see there is a couple of actions that occur behind the scenes. So it's going to say, hey, take the target value, store it against the month key in an Azure SQL database. And then because it has the Power BI integration link to it, I'm going to ask it to call the Power BI integration and refresh the data set on the Power BI site as well. We take the app, we save it, we publish it, and we've got to share it so that users can consume it. So that's that Power BI integration I talked about. That only appears inside the Power App if you create the Power App from Power BI, because then it passes through, and that's how it's going to access the month key field from the Power BI report, is using that Power BI integration point. Once we've published and saved, we also take the Power BI report, we publish and save that. So you see here now I've got my little month key and target. So if I was to pick a data point, you'll see that the values should change over time. And of course, it's going to go buggy on me, isn't it? Yeah. But imagine it's changing, because it should. There we go. Now it's changing. So you can see it changes the value. So I could go in and edit that and say, yep, actually I want to change it to a 5. When I press the button to submit, that'll update the record and you see instantaneously it's reflected in the visualization. That's because I'm calling the refresh as part of the submit button. So this is an area where the Power Apps integration to Power BI is quite cool because you can get that instant feedback. So if you're thinking about using this for customers, for products, or for your own company, you might do it for commentary against data elements, which I've seen with a lot of orgs. They do financial stats and they want to comment why the financial indications were lower or higher, or you might just want to enter details. And this is going to pop up and ask me to authenticate. So we'll just let it authenticate behind the scenes. Cool. All right. So the main scenario that we use that Power Apps, Power BI integration is for write back. So it's things like adding comments, anything that you don't currently capture the data for and you want to start capturing it. So I wasn't capturing monthly target. It didn't make sense to change any of my other systems. So I introduced Power Apps into the platform. I will tell you when I've explored doing Power Apps more commercially on a large scale, the cost profile is quite high. So be considerate when you're thinking about adding Power Apps into your ecosystem because it does have its own licensing model and it's often per user based. So if you think about, 20, 40, 60, 80, 20,000 users, the pricing for a Power App, whilst it's low code, no code, can get quite high. It is for that data entry scenario and for your what if scenario because it means I can have a data entry point on my Power BI visual, use it to enter what if information, and then have that automatically reflected on the Power BI report. And it's not overly complicated, like you don't have to be a pro dev to use it, but I will say it is quite fiddly to get understood. I come from a programming background, so I'm okay with it, but I can see how a more of a citizen dev or a business user is going to look at that and go, well, that's a lot of code. But don't worry, Copilot and things like that can help you these days. They're rolling those out. Let's take a bit of a detour and look at the opposite, Power Apps with Power BI. So let's say we didn't start with having our executive sales report. We started by being, say, a field engineer who was getting information about utilities data. So we start with the app. We've already got a Power App in play, and now we want to expand the visualization capability. We might want to see trends, we might want to see forecasting, we might want to see our inventory stocks. If you're inside Power Apps, and this is a model-driven app, this one, then you can see we've got very limited inbuilt charting capability. We've got pretty much the pie chart, and that's kind of it. So you're very, very limited. And when you've got this absolute array of visualizations that Power BI provides, you kind of want to leverage it where you can. So if we're inside Power Apps and you want to look at your data, you've got two options. You can visualize the data directly in the Power Apps platform, or we can introduce and embed a Power BI tile into a Power App. So when we're looking at the data, there's an option in the little toolbar up the top to visualize this view. If you don't see this, your admin has likely turned it off. It is something that an admin can restrict access to. So once we click to visualize this data, so I've got my model-driven data here, we're looking at active challenges. It's going to go and do almost similar to what Q&A and other products do within Power BI. It's going to interrogate that data and try and come up with some recommendations. So it'll start generating a report for us, and then it'll produce a nice looking quick summary. We can go ahead, if we like this quick summary, we can save it back to Power BI. We can make changes to it. It basically is just built a Power BI report for us, but you can see our visual capability is much higher. But it does mean you've got to go between the two products, between Power BI and Power Apps. So here we can save it. We can tell it where we want to save it to, my workspace, and that's one of the options. The other option we have is to embed a Power BI visual within Power Apps. Now, this in itself is quite limiting because it's only a Power BI dashboard, so not a report, a dashboard, and then within a dashboard, a tile. So if you are able to build your report in such a way that you have a tile that will be useful for your Power App users, you can take that tile and place it into a Power App. So inside the Power App editing area, we have the option to insert the Power BI tile. With that tile, we're going to specify what workspace is it coming from, what dashboard, and what tile. Now, this is not a B2B cross-tenant scenario, so it's already authenticating with the same account I went into Power Automate with, Power Apps with. So make sure that you're logged in as the correct user when you try to do this. So we're going to select the workspace. Within the workspace, we select the dashboard. Within the dashboard, we pick the exact tile. So you can see here, I'm doing a little mobile phone app, so it's quite small. So my visualization is just to show me sort of a total in a column graph. You may do any number of reporting visualizations here. Your options are extensive because you have all the Power BI visuals to work from. They just have to render in a little tile, and then that tile is what's placed inside the Power App itself. So the use cases there of when you might want to use it is predominantly when you want better visuals, really, because the Power Apps visualizations are quite limited. It's similar in Power BI in that it's now giving you a single pane of glass, so users don't have to toggle between the two once you embed the tile. If you just hit the visualize your data, you are switching between the two, but it means you can quickly generate a report off your data. So where I see this mostly is that field engineer scenario. Think about your staff walking around, Walmart, Walgreens, whatever the case may be, Target, and they're going around doing stock take. They can automatically see the stock levels on their phone, which is pretty cool. I've always wanted to do it where I scan pantry items in my house so that I can do like a food inventory so that when I'm at the shops, I know exactly what's already in my house. But I've not got that far to building it. So now on our journey, let's say what happens if we want to add 10%? We've got those monthly targets. We're showing them against our sales. What if we did the what if scenario, not using the what if and parameters, but actually using a Power Automate visualization? So Power Automate, just like Power Apps, but deja vu, it is a visualization. So you can just drop it on the Power BI canvas. I usually do this one in desktop, but I would say you can probably do it in service as well because a lot of the capability for report editing and authoring is now available in both. So we pick the Power Automate visual. Of course, it loves to log in it when I want to do so. By the way, if anyone has questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. I can see the chat on my second screen here. And if it looks like I'm looking all over the place, I have a second monitor next to me. So with Power Automate, we drop that visual on. We don't get the same capabilities as Power Apps because it's not going to provide a form style entry or a gallery. It's just going to be a button that sits on the Power BI report. So with that button, you can see here that if we expand the visual, so it takes up more of the focus area so that we can see all the information, we don't need to pass it any fields. We just need to edit the actual Power Automate because with Power Automate, it's a triggering system. So you've got the options. So I should say it's a business process flow automation and it has a trigger. That trigger can be manual, it can be instant, it can be cloud. There's also the concept of Power Automate desktop, which is entirely different. They refer to that, I think, more as robotic process automation. It can simulate what you're doing on your desktop. But in this case, we're going to do a cloud flow, and it's going to be automated by Power BI itself. So Power BI is going to be the trigger point. So we go into the visual, we hit the dot, 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 and we go to edit. That's going to cut over to looking at the Power Automate IDE, which is make.powerautomate.com, but it's going to render it inside Power BI desktop. So we're working with it from its IDE, but rendered inside Power BI. I could go to the actual make.powerautomate.com, make changes, build this, and look at it. So I'm going to create a little basic Power Automate flow here. I'm going to say when a button is clicked on a Power BI report, that's going to be my trigger. Then what I want to do is execute some SQL. I've hard-coded it here. I wouldn't hard-code this for a customer, but in this case, it's hard-coded to say, hey, take the target value, times it by 0.1. I think in my actual environment, it's times by 0.5 for a dramatic effect. And then it will run that against my SQL source, and then it's going to refresh the data set behind the Power BI report, and then that will end the flow. So you see it's a basic little flow here. We could do any number of steps. I could tell it to send myself an email, I could take an image, or any number of things are available with the Power Automate. Also, it is a different license. So in this case, I have both a Power Automate license and a Power BI license. So now you can see we've got the little run flow button. If I was to click that, it's going to run the Power Automate flow. It's going to adjust the monthly targets. The difference with it and Power Apps is that Power Apps can refresh the data set and the visual will show the information straight away. In this case, it's run the flow, it's made changes to the data, but it's not automatically reflected on the report. You have to refresh it to be able to see the changes. If we load up the actual Power Automate, which I've got on my other screen, so let me just move it so you can see what it's doing. And we'll, oops, We'll zoom that a bit. So this is my Power Automate flow. So this is inside the make.powerautomate.com. You can see we have the flow here. If I refresh, we'll probably see that 2 runs have occurred. So we can see our run history over time. And in this case, it's failed. Interestingly, it's failed. It didn't fail this morning. Let's have a look. So with any time a Power Automate flow fails or runs successfully, you can go in and look at the exact run details of the flow itself. Chances are I've probably changed something and it's not happy. Yep, didn't like the data type. So we can see here that it was the Power BI button was clicked, that was successful, got the little green tick. We can see here that when it went to execute the SQL, it's failed. It will tell me that the details of the input as well as the error. So we can see here arithmetic error, converting expression to data type int, the statement has been terminated. So standard SQL error doesn't like the value that it's trying to replace it with. So we can go ahead and I can debug that and change that so it doesn't error. But imagine that did run. It would actually update. So if I click this selected successful one, I should say not selected one, successful one, I can go in and see one I ran earlier today. So it's going to run that same SQL statement so we can see the input, update the monthly target, set the target to itself times 0.5, and then output is result successful because it's empty set. So imagine that did that, but you'll notice it doesn't automatically refresh this when you do this live. So just picture this didn't refresh, which it didn't refresh anyway because it errored. But if the SQL ran successfully, it would change the value, but it doesn't refresh the report because the Power Automate flow, whilst it knows about Power BI, it can refresh the data, but it can't actually refresh the visualization. So you have to manually refresh that. But it does mean we can do any number of things behind that button. You might have it for your team members to say, yep, the monthly stats for our team look good. So when they click that flow, it can send an email to the executive to say the report's ready to be reviewed. Or it might just be you want to put information behind the scenes, like on the 3rd of the month, you update the figures, you run that behind that button. Any number of things you might want to do behind that. I actually have it now to turn on and off fabric capacities. So I have a button inside a Power BI report that goes to my fabric capacity inside Azure and starts it up so that I'm not blowing my budget all the time. So we talked about how you can manage your flows there. Now let's talk about our next thing on the journey. And as I say that, it's asking to authenticate on my other screen. Love that. The downside of integrations, asking authentication all the time. All right. So back on our journey, the boss is busy. This has happened to me in real life. My boss has been very busy and they're like, hey, can you just send me some screenshots of what's happening this month so that we can look at it overnight in the files. Odd, I know, because users can just open the Power BI report and look at the data, but sometimes you have different business users, different use cases. They like to operate differently. Sometimes rather than have the live interactive Power BI report, they just want in their inbox the answer and off they go. Sometimes it's for an audit, so they need a snapshot of capture. But we can use Power Automate for that. Now, interestingly, if you've never worked with Power Automate, here's an example of if I'm in a new Power Automate flow and I say add a task or an action, it'll come up with the list of possible actions. So in this case, I've asked it what Power BI actions can we take, and it's showing me a list of all the different Power BI tasks we can do. Nowhere on that screen does it tell you which ones need premium connectors. So when it needs premium, it actually needs a premium capacity. So when I tried to do this a while back when I created this demo, I had been accustomed to working with customers and demo environments that had premium capacities in. And then I went to do it in a tenant that didn't have it. And I was like, uh-oh, these need premium. So, and you can't use premium per user. What I found, and it probably is even more advantageous now with the introduction of Fabric, is that I could spin up a Power BI embedded inside my Azure subscription and then use that to do the demos and then turn it off inside Azure so I wasn't blowing the budget. But if you are looking to use some of these features, just be mindful they may be premium capacity related. So you'll probably have to have one of the premium capacities in Power BI. And I hazard a guess that it translates to one of the Fabric SKUs as well, but I haven't tested it myself. And of course, Power BI embedded also works because that's how I did it for this one. But you can see we can do lots of things. We can add rows if we're doing sort of pub sub data sets. We can get copies of our report. This is similar to going into a report and saying file export and having that static image. we can pass queries through if we wanted to. So in my case, this is my overview of a flow I'm going to walk you through, but I've got a manually triggered flow. So this is one where I actually go into Power Automate and say run the flow. It's not activated by a button inside a Power BI report. It's going to go to SharePoint and SharePoint backed by OneDrive. It's going to look for an Excel file. That file has a number of data points in it. It's going to take those data points and loop through. So that apply for each is going to take each record of the Excel file. And then what it's going to do is go to a particular Power BI report. It's going to apply the URL filtering. If you've never seen URL filtering, a Power BI report, you can obviously click around. And so you can do slices, you can do the filter pane. You can actually also supply filters in the URL itself. So I could go to a specific URL, pass a filter that says year equals 2024, and it's going to filter the underlying data set to that value. Once it's done that and we take an export, it's then going to send me an email, or it's going to send my coworker, in this case, Timothy McGee, because I love NCIS. It's going to send them an email, and that will give them a copy of that report. So if we look at that in a bit more depth, this is my Excel spreadsheet. There's a number of reasons I have these columns. So the first one's the fiscal year. That lets me know what's the fiscal year we want to filter to. Then the URL filter is actually an expression that says take the value from column A and put it inside the little single quotes, and then filter the fiscal year parameter. Now, the reason it's got the X0020 and underscore either side is because when you place a field name into the URL, if it has a space, it's got to be able to apply in a web URL browser. So it'll put the equivalent of a space in, I think it's like, I forget the exact language. I want to say ants code characters, but that's not right. That's something else. But basically, that's what it's doing. And then what's EQ is the equivalent of equals. In that expression language. The other thing I provided is the file name. That's just because I wasn't super savvy when I created this and wasn't sure how to add the extension on. So I thought, no need, I'll just create it in the file here, because all these values I can get to inside the Power Automate flow. So once we're in Power Automate, click. There we go. You can see I've listed the SharePoint site. I've gone to a specific file and I'm taking table 1 from that file. So I could do all sorts of savvy Excel things here. I could get different tables within an Excel spreadsheet, but in my case, I just need this little one. And then I take that and I'm going to call a particular Power BI report. So I specify the report in the workspace. I tell it the format I want to export it as. So in my case, I'm going PDF. That could be PNG, JPEG, any number of things. And then I'm supplying the report level filter as the output of the previous task. So that Excel, get the URL filter column from that Excel, and then I can paste that in. So with Power Automate, you can use outputs from previous tasks, and you can also set variables. So it does allow you to pass things from one task to the next to the next. We also specify then in the email who we're going to send the email to. So I've hard-coded here, but I could put that in my spreadsheet as well. A subject line, and I include in the subject line one of the parameter values, and I'll explain why, although I've got a feeling I broke the demo, but I'll explain it why anyway. And then inside the email, I actually tell it, hey, this is generating for this parameter value from the Excel spreadsheet, but also this is the date and time it was generated. So if something changes, in the coming days and weeks, and they go to look back, they have sort of an audit trail to go, oh no, this was generated on this date. So if data engineering has a problem and the data didn't load successfully, we know when the executive got the report. Then we're going to apply attachments. So this is where we specify that file name. So otherwise I could put an actual value in there, but because I want it to have the correct extension, I'm pulling it from the Excel file. And then in the body of that attachment, or what the actual contents are, is the output of the export to Power BI report. So now when we go and run that flow, this is what the user is going to get in an email. So they're going to see an email that says, here's the attachment. The attachment has the file name matching the spreadsheet. In the body of the email, it says, yeah, this was generated for FY 2018. But you'll notice that there's a couple of things that happen with the report. The slicer pane isn't updated because I'm using the URL filtering, not the actual interactive slicer behavior. So you got to watch for that. Sometimes the screenshot doesn't reflect exactly what you're doing because you're using the URL filtering behavior. A couple of the visuals there have the little shield broken. Now that's just because it doesn't render those on export. That's Power Automate button and the Power App visual, so that's okay that they're not there. And this is why I make sure that the file name includes what I filtered to, or somewhere in the email it says. So in this case, I know it's FY 2018, and therefore it doesn't matter what's reflected on the slicer. The user knows what it's correctly for. I say this might be broken because I'm looking at that calendar graph going 2019 to 2020 is actually a different fiscal year to 2018. So chances are I've possibly broken the URL filtering when I took that screenshot. But be mindful of that. Not always is the behavior on export when you're doing it in an automated approach matching what you would do if you were working with it direct in the browser, clicking slices and things. So you want to make sure anything that's not 100% clear that you put in the email so people know. So the key use case I use this for is anytime you want to do things like bulk updating of data, you want to send notifications. I could send it to a Teams message as a card there as well. If you want to do exporting, I've seen organizations where they actually have TVs plastered around their office space. Those TVs can render a folder full of images they can cycle through. So what they do is run Power Automate scripts to export images of some of their Power BI reports, like their monthly billing or their service desk ticket queues and everything. They put those in a folder, and then the TVs can cycle them through as dashboards for the staff. Also think about it, which a lot of people I know, they're so focused on report development and that space that they forget that all the Power BI administration. So someone might request access to a workspace, access to a report. Those are all things you can look to automate because there are APIs behind that. So you might have I've used here buttons with Power Automate, I've used Power Apps, but there's nothing stopping you from using something like Forms. Microsoft Forms takes the workspace name, takes the username, takes the permission they want, kicks off a Power Automate flow, and assuming there's no approvals, you can add an approval flow in there if you wanted to, but you could then call the APIs to add that user to the workspace they've asked for and log it in some sort of audit trail. So you can think about doing your Power BI administration more automated using things like Power Automate. Now we head on over, we want to collaborate with people, so we might use Teams. Now within Teams, there's a number of different options that you have. So we've got Power BI as an app. So if you've ever worked with Teams like today, you'll see that left navigation menu has a series of apps. You can add Power BI into that left navigation menu as another app. You can also add it as a tab. So if you're chatting with a group of users or a Teams channel within a Teams group, or you're just doing a one-on-one chat conversation, you can add a tab. That tab could be a Power BI tab. You can also add cards, which means when you're copy pasting or putting text as a post, there's the option to do a card visualization there, which happens sort of by default when you give it a URL. Mindful of the licensing that's needed to use some of these features. So if we were to add as an app, it's as simple as hitting the little dot, 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 and then we search for the Power BI app, and then we add that in. If you like that app and you want it on for all users or available for all users, you can ask your Teams administrator set up this app as a default. So it is possible to default the app there. So we select the Power BI app. That means we basically have the Power BI service, aka Fabric service with the Power BI experience pre-selected inside Teams. So we don't have to go out of Teams. It also means you don't have to worry about logging in again because it's using your Teams login. Unless you're doing cross organization B2B or B2C, then you would actually have to switch to the Teams for that organization to see it because it's not going to render another organization's Power BI inside your Teams. So here we can do all the things we would normally do. We can view reports, we can create reports, we can edit reports. It's entirely interactive. So we can go in and look at different reports and interact with them, apply filters as we would normally. And we do that all within the Teams interface. If we want to create a new report, we can, assuming we have enough access, I should say. In my case, I've got full access. I've got a Power BI Fabric administrator, but we can go ahead and we can create a report there and publish it in. If we wanted to add it as a tab, so I have here a general channel, I can go ahead and hit the little plus button up the top. I'll select that I want to add Power BI as my tab. Now the sad bit is you can't just add a full-on app there. You have to pick an individual report page or an app page. So we can go in and say which workspace we want to show, and then within that, which of the actual reports we want to show. So we don't get as awesome as I'd like to just be able to pick an app. It's not that great. But where I find this really cool is when you're doing a pilot with a group of users. So I was doing some Crystal Report replacement work for a company once, and I would actually work with a number of users that were new to Power BI. So they knew how to use Teams. So I set up a little pilot group. Initially, I started with probably under 100, and then over time, I added, into the hundreds of users onto that Teams channel. And then I would put the Power BI report as a tab. So at that stage of report development, I didn't have to worry about teaching them to log into Power BI and the multi-factor authentication that's required. I could just go, here's the report, let me know what you think. And then as we work through the release cycle, I would remove the tab so no one was interacting with it while we're doing the next release. And then when it was ready to pilot, I'd put the tab back in and say, all right, here's the next version of the Power BI report. Take a look, let me know what you think. So as you can see here, we got the option to pick the workspace or the app. And then once we're in there, we pick the individual sort of page kind of thing for the app or the report itself. When you do add it, you get the option to post a message to a channel. If you don't want to spam your users while you're playing around with this, untick that option, which is the post to the channel. But once you're ready to, you can post it to the channel because that's kind of handy because not everyone knows that you're just adding tabs. So unless they look or they're informed, they don't know. So it's kind of handy that when you're going through this wizard, you can say, hey, look, can you post a channel to let everyone know I've added this tab? And then they get an instant notification and can have a look. So once you've done that, this is how it will appear in the chat. So you'll see that you've added the tab and what the tab name is. And we can see up the top there, we got the customer profitability. If we were to click that, it is a full interactive Power BI experience. So we don't see all the menus. So I don't see like my workspace, my quick start, my profile, all that. I just sort of see the report and I can interact with it. We can apply all the filtering as we would normally. We can go through the pages of the report once we have it loaded there. So it's kind of handy, all the different features you can do now. If you have hidden the filter pane, you won't see it. But in this case, I've got it unhid, visible, because visible is the version of unhid. You can use the chat feature. Be mindful when you're using the chat feature. I tend to avoid this feature. People forget that when you're in the chat, whilst what you see on the screen is for your user profile. So if you're using things like row level security, column level, object level security, you start posting things like, oh, the FY 2020 figure of, 5 billion is actually incorrect. The rest of the people in that chat are the other users of that report, which possibly don't have access to see that data point. So either you don't want to be sharing that information in the chat, or they look at it and go, I don't understand. And you end up with this conversation of people going, I don't get why you're posting this, yada, yada. So be mindful that that chat experience is visible to all users of the report. I often don't use it, but when you're doing things like pilots, it's kind of handy to see what the users are experiencing and use that as a support mechanism so they can send you a chat. You can look at it and go, oh, yeah, someone's noticed an issue with this visual. I'll go in, I'll log a ticket, and I'll go work with them about correcting that visual. So it is there, but just be mindful of what it's used for. All right, let's skip on. Skip the chat. Yep, so you can see my lovely little message to myself. All right, the card. Now, the interesting thing with Power BI and Teams, if you just take a URL and paste it into Teams, so this is me chatting to myself, I can say, yep, here's the customer profitability sample. What this doesn't tell me is it's just a link, right? So it's not saying what workspace it's in. It's not saying what tenant I've copied it from. It's not even saying, whether I've got any filters or anything. It's just a URL with a friendly name, and I'm going to assume it's a Power BI report because it says Power BI in the name. But Microsoft has gone really savvy. If you go to the Power BI service and you copy that URL, now I haven't double checked this behavior still goes okay when you've got the Fabric URL, so like the app.fabric.microsoft.com with experience equals to Power BI. When you drop it in, it knows that, hey, this is the Power BI link, so let's give the user more information. So it puts what's called a card, and in that card, it'll say this is the workspace that link is from, and this is the actual item that link is from. Way more helpful to your users to see all that information. If you were to think, I was thinking that the share experience from Power BI would do the same. Unfortunately, it doesn't. So if you're inside Power BI and you say share, and you go, yep, I want to share that to Teams. So I pick Teams, I do my authentication to know which Teams it's going to send the message to. And then it'll say, is there any a channel or group that you want to send it to? But you'll notice here that it's just a URL. So it's really not friendly. So once I do that share, it's just going to put this really giant long URL. I'm decent at reading these, so I can have a bit of an idea, but otherwise, not very helpful. So I would highly recommend, if you're trying to share a Power BI report with someone, copy the URL from the service, paste it directly in Teams, have it render as a card rather than have it render like this, because it's just not super helpful. Why would we want to do that? As I spoke about pilots, pilots is really good to do it through Teams because you don't have to do the multi-factor authentication. Also means that you can drop the report when you don't want people accessing it, or if there's an issue, you might have a production issue, so you want to drop that report so people aren't in it while you fix the data, for collaboration and also for communication as you go through new release features. So now, last but not least on our journey, we're going to make that board meeting a little bit more exciting. So within Power BI, we've got two options to work with PowerPoint. One is embedded and one is static. So with the embedding as an image, so inside a Power BI report, you go into the export menu, go to PowerPoint, and then say embed as image. Once we've done that, we can specify, are we doing it with the current values, like if we've got some filtering applied or not, and whether we only want the current page or the full actual Power BI report. We go and say, yep, set everything, hit export. We get the nice little spinny wheel to say, yeah, exporting in progress. We'll let you know when it's done. Once it's done, we get the little link that says open up our PowerPoint file, and we have static copies of our report. This may be helpful if you're doing, say, an annual board meeting, or you've got an audit going on and they need a static copy of the data at a point in time that's available in your Power BI reporting. This could be who's got certain permission sets within your data. Then you can go ahead and export that report. And so the first page, which I don't show here, actually tells you what workspace and report has been exported. And then the rest is actually screenshots as at the point in time. So that's kind of handy, but it's very static. So if I send that around to a user, they have visibility of the report contents, but not the underlying data, and they can't interact with it. If we go the other option, and let me just authenticate behind the scenes, the other option is to embed live. So with the embedding of live Power BI, means that Power BI report is now going to render inside PowerPoint. So if we select the embed live, we'll get a pop-up that says copy the link. And of course now there we go. Click. So you got the option to copy a link there. So we're going to say copy that link. And then we go into PowerPoint, and inside PowerPoint, there'll be a little Power BI insert on the ribbon up the top. We click that Power BI, and then it'll paste in the URL that we copied from the service export, and then we get a fully interactive Power BI report inside PowerPoint. So if we click any of these data points, it's fully interactive as we would do in the service. We get access to the filter pane, we get access to all the slices, we can see where the report has come from, and we can also go in and refresh. This is the little frustrating thing, is that in service, a lot of things are up the top. Inside PowerPoint, it's actually down the bottom. So we can refresh that, we can reset it if we wanted to. We can also hide things like the filter pane to get a full render. If we want to see it more full screen, we can go in, and this is all sitting inside PowerPoint. It does mean the user who opens this PowerPoint file has to have access to the Power BI report for this to actually render. So you would have possibly seen on the other side of this Teams call the authentication popping up, because I had to authenticate to make sure that I have access to what's embedded inside this Power BI report. The sensitivity labels don't apply a restriction in terms of security. So if you're thinking they do, they don't. You can have a Power BI report and a PowerPoint file with two different sensitivity labels or Microsoft Information Protection labels applied, and that won't matter. What matters is, does the user have access to the Power BI report that's being shown here directly in the service? If they do, it will render inside the PowerPoint file. If they don't, it will error saying you don't have access. I forget the exact error. I should put a screenshot in, but it will error and not render it. So if I was to send this PowerPoint file around to yourselves, because you don't have access to the report, it just won't render. It'll ask for a login and then error. So the big use case for that And as I click around, that it's all dynamic. Oh, it's got my tab selection. Click. There we go. Now it's switching slide. So the biggest use case, if it's static, think about sharing it without giving access to the actual underlying data itself. It doesn't allow you to refresh, great for any formal documentation. When it's in a dynamic case, so that might be, your weekly status report with management or your team about, work item tracking, you can go in and have a repeatable report that's available. So you can go through your standard, tasks that you go through in the meeting, and then you have the Power BI report there. You don't have to switch platforms to view it, and it means you can answer things like basically do a live Q&A with your team or with your management. So if they want to know about particular figures, you can go in and, assuming you know the report well enough, you'll be able to answer them or take those questions away and answer them separately or make changes to your report for the next meeting. Some other integrations that we didn't cover off. You've got Power Apps in Teams. You can do that as well. You can also do Power Automate in Teams. There's also a really cool one with Visio. You can have Visio to map out your business process flow and then tie that to your data points so you can see how your data is going through that flow at any point in time. Some other considerations that we didn't cover off, if you've got siloed teams, so if I have a team working on Power BI, a team working on Power Apps, a team working on Power Automate, but we want to do things that go across the teams, you've got to be mindful of having governance models and conversations that work going across the different teams. The other thing is when you're looking to introduce integrations between the platforms, as I said earlier, environments is what Power Automate and Power Apps uses, and workspaces is what Power BI uses for its containerization level. So you want to look when you're doing change and release management from dev to test to prod, which environment are you using for two of the products and which workspace are you using for the other one. And of course, the big one, licensing, because each of those products is licensed independently. There is no concept of like a Power Platform license. There is some niceties if you've got enterprise licensing agreements, I think predominantly E5, perhaps a little bit in E3, but predominantly E5. In some cases, that will give you things like Power BI Pro license. So you're not having to do an additional because you're covered by one of your enterprise licenses, but then your additional is your premium connectors. Some references in case you want to learn more. I realize these are hyperlinks on a screen that you can't see because I haven't shared this as a PowerPoint live, but I can send a PDF copy of this slide deck out to anyone that's interested, or you're more than happy to have you reach out to me on sort of socials or my blog and ask for a copy. I really don't mind. And thank you for all attending. If you have questions, now is a great time to ask, but otherwise, you're more than welcome to reach out to me on socials. Go to my blog. It's not always updated, but it does have a contact me. Ask me questions if you're looking to try out these integrations and you need a little bit of help. Feel free to get in touch with me. As I said at the start, for those of you who join later, I am based in Australia predominantly, so it may take like a 24-hour delay for me to reply to any messages. But at the moment, I'm in the US. So huge thank you, and thank you for having me. And I hope I've been able to share with you all, all these different integrations to help you get started or have an idea if it's something that suits your org.
Well, thank you so much, Heidi. This was awesome. And it's funny because you were doing that when you got to the Power BI within PowerPoint. I was noticing earlier, I was like, wait, is she doing Power BI directly through her slide deck? That's actually really cool. So I'm like, oh, that was awesome. So I was glad that you covered that. So
It's lots of fun because I'm like, oh, you stupid people are going to pick this up right from the start.
it took, I wasn't a student. It took me a while, but I eventually picked it up. So that was actually really cool. So yeah, any questions? I don't think we have anything from the chat, but Josephine did note that we are going to make this available on our YouTube channel. So if you want to rewatch this again, you get a chance to, and you can also freeze and make sure you've got Heidi's information if you don't yet. But this was a really great presentation, a really great intro covering all of the different things. I knew some of it, but it was great seeing all of the different options that were available. So
Lots of fun. I love the fact that I used to, when I started working with Fabric, I was like, oh, this is painful to go to the portal and start my capacity. And when I was just doing demos. And then I realized I was like, I'll just put a Power Automate in. So I have a report in my workspace that I just go to, pick which capacity I want, turn it on, and it just does it all for me.
That's very cool.
I have
All
a
right.
question.
Sure.
So for Power Apps, when we create an app, we create a solution, environment and solution, and put that app in. So when we want to use that app into Power BI report, is that where we start normally? Create a environment, put it in a solution, and then use it in Power BI in a tile?
Great question. It'll be the other way around, sadly, because in order for Power Apps to know that it's tied to Power BI, you have to create it via Power BI. So when you're in Power BI and you drop the Power App visual in, that
Mhm.
will then allow you to create a new app from there. When you create that new app from Power BI, you pick the environment and everything that you're going to put it into, but you will then have the Power BI integration aspect there, so it now knows that this app is linked to that Power BI. The solutioning is separate. That's part of Power Apps to be able to change release manager solution or an app from one environment to the next, or from one environment to sort of export import when you're moving things around. So it's slightly different, and it's a bit frustrating because you can't go to the Power App and say, hey, Power App, I now want you to know about this Power BI report. It has to go the other way around. Power BI tells Power Apps, hey, this is the Power BI integration. It puts all the details in. And it's also frustrating because it's not like the other connections that Power Apps can have. You can't just say edit connection and pick the workspace in the report to cut it over. So
Mm.
it's very fiddly.
Okay, thank you. It
That's right.
still makes sense. One more thing about Power BI, we usually bring all the data from SQL Server. But I know to be able to use, like I learned to be use SQL Server in Power Apps, it is a premium connector. So all that licensing needs to be sorted out before I start using this uh,
Yeah, so you can use
system.
trials
Okay.
if you wanna just do a proof of concept in your org or proof of value or like a little test run, there is the option to use a trial, and Power Apps has what's called a developer, I think it's developer community plan, which allows you to
Mhm.
try out Power Apps, and then you can use the premium connectors in a trial sense. But you'll know straight away because inside Power Apps, unlike Power Automate, inside Power Apps, when you go to do a new connection, it separates out the premium from the non-premium. I think it has a little diamond icon next to them. But effectively, almost everything is a premium connector except for, I think, SharePoint list.
Okay.
So yeah, if you're using SQL Server, whether it's Azure SQL or on-prem, it will be a premium connector because it's like a relational database store. And you can also use the on-prem gateway the same as you would Power BI. So Power BI's on-prem gateway is also accessible with Power Apps.
Awesome. Good to know. Thank you.
Sure.
All right. So I think with that, we can wrap things up. We're going to have, thank you again, Heidi, for presenting. This was awesome. This was really useful. Um, so thank you for taking the time.